I cannot see any meeting chat or anything like that. So if anyone sees something in meeting chat, something like that, just yell out. We're going to have plenty of time for this presentation. One of the things I never, ever do is extend things before lunch or before the end of the day, because, well, that's no fun. That's like, so I'll give people about 1 more minute to go in. We'll dive in. Hopefully it'll be interesting. If you don't enjoy the presentation, you'll enjoy your nap. Win-win. So, but this is pretty cool stuff. So. We'll call it good. I'll go ahead and get started. The most important thing about any kind of presentation is that you actually get something useful out of it. So feel free to speak up, ask questions and all this kind of stuff, because what happens is, as is the case with many technical things, there's a million ways to do things. It's sort of like describing how to cook to someone when you don't know what they want to make. And the way I would begin this one is saying, why do you care about JQ to begin with? And in a nutshell, it's because when you're working with Folio, you're going to be doing everything in JSON. You send JSON messages to Folio, JSON messages come back. You need to be able to evaluate, transform, all this kind of stuff. And this JQ makes stuff so much easier. I actually changed the environment I worked in. EBSCO, our part of it is basically a Python shop. But one of the reasons I tend to do, if you do the API stuff, you'll see that I do a lot of stuff in Bash. And a lot of that has to do with that Python does not have JQ bindings for it. And the other thing is you can, like, for example, if you have some like massive inventory dump of JSON, in a couple seconds, in just a few words, you can convert it to call number, title, whatever you want, sorted with different levels of records, suitable for Excel. You can count how many occurrences you have of everything. One of the things I love to do with it all the time is just you can manipulate records in real time in a VI subshell. So, I mean, I can just open 250,000 records in a file and then just transform before my eyes without having intermediate time, without having intermediate files. It saves enormous amounts of time. And so, like, the second example here, let's suppose you have some like massive, some massive update problem where you have, we extracted all these records from Folio, real use case scenario. I didn't introduce who I am. I am a implementation consultant with EBSCO. And so what I do for work in a normal day is I help people get into Folio. And then the other thing I help them do is after they're in Folio, if they have problems, I'll help them with that too. And so the type of problem I have is like, how do you build the JSON so that we'll go in Folio? Oh yeah, we migrated and now we need to change 2 million records. And so I help with that too. And so the easy way is the way I want to do it. So, and then, that's the other thing. Why JQ? And I still haven't even told you what it is, but I still think it's most important to say why. Why is the most important question always, because not what or anything like that. Why do you care? Why not fall asleep immediately? JQ will cut like butter through millions of records. Nothing even comes close in terms of ease. And so the other thing is it works in any environment. Like I tend to use the two environments I use the most is we have our dedicated Amazon instances of which we work for most of our stuff. And then I use Windows Subsystem for Linux, but this will work in, just regular old PowerShell, Mac, you name it. And so it has no runtime dependencies. You don't need to be running anything else. And you just drop it in so that it's just wherever you work. So what do you do with it? One of the really basic things you can do with it is I use it for just validating JSON all the time, because you have a large JSON document. It has one character off, and boy, that's a lot of fun. JQ will tell you exactly what the problem is and where. You can do arbitrary extractions. The way that JSON works in the way it's normally described JSON is you have a bunch of dictionaries, which basically means you have an object inside an object and you have a label. This is I don't know, this is a note. This is the type of note, and so on and so forth. And you stack things up. What happens with regular programming languages and stuff like that, if you want to access stuff, you have to know how to address it. Like if you wanted to get the third node or something like that, you have to have some way of either iterating through it or having some sort of process that goes through that. JQ lets you kind of like get around that. We're going to get to the disadvantages because there's some problems with it too. Modifying JSON objects. We do this all the time. The most common use I get for this is you have this long list of, oh, we have all these things, we need to change to something else. And so what I do is you have a stream of records coming in, and then as the stream's coming in, you do an arbitrary manipulation and push it back while you're doing simultaneously. And also reformatting. We get this all the time. We need to convert this to flatten the JSON out into something that that is actionable, reporting and whatnot. And like one of the things that's kind of cool about Folio is that when you're doing like, let's suppose you wanted to do some sort of item report or like type of thing that is kind of like my brain right now. Give us a list of everybody with more than X number of dollars, like loan fees or something like that. JQ with a couple object files makes this pretty easy to do. And so very, very good for that. Like the type of stuff that people will usually do some massive export, put it in a database system and all this kind of stuff. No need to do that. And then I think I had mentioned the easy shell integration. I like it's kind of like there all the time. I use it inside VI and whatnot. Now, what is it exactly? Just a lightweight command line JSON processor. It is written in it's written in C. The author compares it to the stream editor, but I think it actually works. What it shares in complexity with what it shares in with the stream editor is you have this syntax that everybody hates. You have this. You can string things along, and it's very fast and slick, and you do it kind of like in a serial way. But it's really more similar to like XSLT. My apologies to JQ for this because I hate XSLT, but what it allows you to do is it allows you to do all kinds of complex manipulations within objects. You can nest stuff and whatnot. It'll give you enough to it can give you a headache, but we'll talk about how it works. Plays well with pipes if you're like a Unix type geek, which is important, and it's got the documentation. We'll talk about the documentation, but as is the case with most types of documentation, it's only useful if you already know what you're looking at. But that's what that's what the internet's for. Like, how do I do this? How do I do that? Couple broad things, which they don't say in the documentation, I don't think. JQ assumes that all your input is JSON unless you say otherwise. And that might sound obvious, but like, let's suppose you wanted to put in, I want to input this text file into this JSON document and put it in like that. You need to tell it otherwise. Or alternatively, I want to output stuff which is a JSONified string, i.e. something that I can put inside JSON. You have to tell it if you are not doing JSON directly, because otherwise it's going to cause errors. The second thing, and this is kind of like a core concept to JQ, is everything is a filter in JSON. And this is where it shares similarity with a stream editor. Because let's suppose, and unfortunately, stream editor is going to mean nothing to anyone who's not a Unix geek, but for people who are, it's going to mean a lot. And so what the stream editor is this archaic thing, I think from the 70s, I believe. Awesome program. I use it all the time. Because one of the great things about that time was computing power was expensive, disk was expensive, everything was expensive. And so if you want to tear through gigabytes of data really fast and change things arbitrarily, it's a very, very useful tool. Like even like those old utilities like TR, change one character, you'd be amazed how useful they are. But anyway, I digress. With the stream editor, let's suppose you want to do a complex series of transformations. You could do hundreds of them. You simply stack them on lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You just type them in or put them in a file or something like that. JQ works like that. And so that's kind of good. The third point is really important. When they make things lightweight, that means it does not have intelligence built in, which is actually a good thing, because when you have, there's nothing like something that tries to outsmart you. Like, for example, one of my other biases, boy, see, that's, I get up the podium, I get to say what all my biases are, but I do not like opinionated programming languages. And I'll tell you why. The reason is that library data is very messy because they acquired over many decades. And so what happens is when you're using opinionated programming language, they'll say, oh, this is invalid, blah, 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 correct your data, correct your input. I was like, oh, yeah, right. They've got millions of records that, like were acquired 20 years before they started. Just tell them to fix it all. No problem. They'll do that. And so I like unopinionated things that just do what I tell them. And so JQ is unopinionated, but it also, that means it will break any time you give it something that it doesn't expect. So if you tell it to take something out, like if you tell it to extract a field and it's not there, you need to say, by the way, make sure this field is there before extracting it. Or if it's null, make sure it's, you have to actually tell it things like that. So you need to know a little bit about your data. Very, very important point when you're first getting started, because otherwise you're just going to get explosions of errors all the time, and then that's no fun. And no fun means you'll quit. You don't want to do that. Syntax. The syntax is, well, you're going to hate it. It's its own thing. It's vaguely familiar with, for some of you that do Unixy type things, there's going to be some stuff that's a little bit familiar, but for most part, it's its own bird. And the downside, the good news and the bad news is the same thing. The standalone, how you don't need anything to run it? Well, the bad news is if you wanted to run it inside another environment, that also will not work. So if you're running Python, it's not like there's a JQ library. And and I doubt there ever will be, because the thinking behind it is so unPythonic. I mean, they would just flip. But the other thing is the other there's no bindings that I'm aware of. And so what that means is when you're using it, you're going to be sticking it someplace else. So one thing you don't want to be doing is sticking it in the middle of a loop. So like, for example, let's suppose you're processing millions of records. You don't want to stick JQ in the middle of a loop and have it being invoked many times. Rather, what you do is you stick it someplace else and think about how you're going to use your data so you only run your filters once. You can run very complicated filters, but you only want to run it once. And so the fact that it's standalone will affect how you process stuff. That's another. Oh, and this also will not mean much to anyone else. Same basic idea, though. If you use VI, you will know how awesome it is. And if you use awk, you'll know how awesome it is. And if you don't know either of those things, this means nothing to you. But what those things also have in common is when you first start, you're lost. Nothing makes any sense. You hate it. But then when you find it out, then you say, oh, well, this is life-changing. I can now die happy. I'm going to list some things. I don't expect anybody to remember anything. It's more to like develop a feel for it. So like you know what type of things to look at for afterwards. You can select things. You can set values. You can transform, delete. You can split arrays. You can join arrays into other things. You can do relative paths like you can with XLT, create variables. So, I mean, a lot of things that are like programming type language type things. But JQ is not a programming language, but it will allow you to do a lot of things that you would normally require code for. Like I said, another analogy I could make that would be less to computer geeks is whether you do or do not read music, if you will recognize it means music means nothing to people who don't read it. And people who do read it will know that it's not going to mean anything to anyone who doesn't read it, but it means a lot to them. JQ syntax is kind of like that. And so once you can see it, once you start feeling it, it becomes its own thing. It's like the air that you breathe. It's easy like everything else after you already know it. You can do all kinds of stuff. I have the list. I know everybody can read, so I'm not going to read all of it, and all the remote people can see this too, so we can save time. Okay, this is a very, very basic selection, the most common thing. So at the top, I have a, like a short JSON document, and so I'm just taking two values. And so you have like a dot in front of the field. And so what it does is it outputs that. And I know you're going to be saying, so what? This gets more interesting with time because I don't know, this reminds me of these like mathematical examples, trains falling from this direction to X miles per hour, trains, who cares? I mean, do they crash? And computer code is like that too. But at the same time, knowing the basic things is you can select fields, you can group them, parens, all that kind of stuff, and you can have really complex nesting. And the filters, I'd already mentioned that being able to select across multiple lines is actually very useful because you just type. You just start typing. You don't have to do any, like for those of you who do other command line stuff, you usually have to put like a backslash or something like that to tell it's another line. JQ, you don't do that, because what's going to do is you just finish, and it's it's just there. So very useful. So now we're doing something slightly more complex. What we have these things in an array. And so what we do is we say, oh, first, let's grab the records. And then we open close brackets means that we're going to take all of the elements of the array, because we could have put in a 0 to take the first object in the array, or a 1, or we can put criteria in there. But right now we're selecting all of them. And then what we're doing is we're sending it to another filter. A pipe indicates the filter. And so what you can do is you can use these pipes to select things, to transform values, just to hold in place. You can do all kinds of things like that. So this is like a kind of like a core concept. So now we're getting to like relative paths. And I know that as we start adding things, and when you're looking with something new, the number of things to forget keeps on increasing. No problem. The important thing to remember is that it's possible. You can use relative paths. In general, I would recommend against them. And the reason is because if you use a relative path, let's think of this logically, whatever's processing has to check all the paths to see if they're there. So if you're cutting through millions of records and you use a relative path, then as soon it has to check all of them, which is going to slow things down. And so if you know something about the paths so that it doesn't have to check these other paths, you can get dramatic speed increase increments. But sometimes when you're only processing a few thousand records or something like that, efficiency makes no difference at all. And you can be lazy and do stuff like that. And so, and you're saying, well, why did you put the select null, select, what's that dot? Dot means everything in JQ. So like dot, what's going on is when you first, cat, for you, those who don't do Unix, it basically says print the document. And then it says go through the objects, select field 1. And it's like, I thought you said you can't select things unless they're there, but I knew they were there, so I didn't put something in front of it because that makes my example lengthier and all that kind of stuff. But what would normally happen is everything that it doesn't match, it's going to return null. Because what it'll do is it'll go through the first object in the array, it will select field 1, but then it will see field 2, which is not field 1. It will output the null very faithfully. And so you do is select the things that are not null, which is exactly what you wanted. So that's kind of like one of these weird non-intuitive type things. And the only reason I bring this up is not because you need to know it outright, but is because when you actually start messing with this, you're going to get errors and garbage. And if you've heard that, I thought I heard something about weeding out the garbage. It's possible. You're still doing it right. It's just that you have one more step to do. So now let's going to make this slightly more complex. we'll select the records only where the field 2 is equal to value 4. So, and then select field 1 from that object. So what this is doing is it's going through and it's saying, well, okay, I'm only going to select the object. It goes through the records. And so now we're inside the records array. And then it's going to select the second object and then grab field 1. And so what you're going to do in like a folio context is more typically you're going to be looking at like loan rules, note types and stuff like that, missing objects. Like when you get errors in the UI or something like that, often it's because there's a missing value. And so you say, okay, is this set to an empty string or a null or something like that when it should be populated? Or let's find all of the call numbers that actually, this was something that came to me this morning. They said, these numbers aren't suppressed. And I was like, well, that's because they were not in the suppressed file, but it did indicate in the call number. So what you can do is you can put a query, select all the stuff that, says it's suppressed in the call number, and then do a transform setting this, discovery suppressed, that kind of stuff. So it's useful for that. And no need to memorize these. There's like a zillion what they call filters. Short version is what most things that you'd want to do are there. You can count things, you can convert things, you can look at things, grab bits of things. It's, normal processy type stuff that you're going to run into like day in and day out. And one of the reasons, a lot of the normalization things. So like, for example, you can do, like regex transformation. So like one of the things that is really useful when you're doing comparisons and stuff like that is to like normalize your data, convert it to keys and stuff like that. It really depends on on what you're doing. And then at the bottom, we have things where we're splitting things, joining things, converting to tab delimited does that natively without having to do any other stuff. So like, for example, if we were going to convert a JSON file to a tab delimited, what you do is you go into your array, and then remember it from I can't remember which slide it was, but it was one that said, remember that everything is JSON. So, well, in JSON, things are arrays. So as soon as we get in the array, now we have this list of objects, but we're going to want to make it an array again. And we're just going to take like both fields that were present and then run it through the convert to tab delimited filter. And then what we did is we were also telling it, give us raw output. Like don't think of the output as JSON, so that way it's going to give us something that looks, it's going to look something like tab delimited. And so one of the things as we go down, we can find out that we can do more complex things. I probably shouldn't have put this example in right away, and I know that nobody can see anything, but what you can do is here, if you could see the example, what you would see is instead of having key value pairs, you just have a bunch of keys. It's the bib mapping rules file. And so the idea is, in a typical folio installation, they're only like 7,000 lines long. And so someone will say, oh, okay, well, what we need is another title field. Let's put it in here. And one easy way to do that, instead of doing it by scratch, since each field is going to be dozens of lines, is to copy one, but then you need to get in the right place. A much easier way, rather than like just moving it around, is to say, why don't you just sort it by the keys I have? And normally, if you actually had keys, you could skip this converting it to entries, because to sort something, it needs to be an array. So what we're doing is we're converting it to array, sorting it by the key, and then and then taking it out of the array. But had it been an actual field, you just say sort by, boom, done. So that part, that was a bad example. But and then now this is getting a little bit more esoteric, but it also gives you ideas of things you could do. For example, one of the things one of the things I'm doing is I'm just feeding, I'm converting a variable into a JSON string. So for example, like JSON, you have to escape all your punctuation and all this kind of stuff. That's a very, very easy way to do that. So that way you don't have to do any regex transforms or anything like that. The second one is, let's suppose when you're working with Folio, a lot of the times you're working with UUIDs, and having a table full of UUIDs is not insanely useful. Well, it can be useful, but it's not always useful, especially if giving a report to someone. So what I've done here is I've converted, you have you're basically hitting the locations endpoint, and you convert all the, what you're doing is you're creating a dictionary based on the ID, which catches the name, and then assigning the variable all in a single line. So now when you read like when you get your report, for example, of where things are located, you can just put the name down rather than put the UUID. And this generic tactic works all the time. And so what we were going to do is, let's suppose we wanted to get, actually this would work for getting all the items out of a system. So on the first line, what we do is we find out how many items are in there. Then what it does is it's going to retrieve them 1,000 at a time. And then it's going to create a tab delimited file with their ID, their effective location ID, and their status. And I know that some of that's a little bit gobbledygooky if you don't read that, but the important things to know is with the JQ part is that all we're doing is hitting the items endpoint with just a regular query. And then when you do any kind of CQL query, it's going to come with an array for that type. So what we do is we grab all the items in the array, and then what we simply do is grab those things out. And so then what we'll do is we'll wind up with something like that. I must have, I guess I was focused on the location at the time because that's what we're going to map. And the status actually appears as text in the storage record. So now, if we look at the next one, the second line, this all recs, that's just what we had from here. That that's from here. And so we inhale the locations, we convert the name to basically a string that's keyed on the dictionary. And then all we do is we iterate through, basically just iterate through the file. I could have done it cleaner. I just use a regex because UUIDs are unique enough, and this is not going to do too much extra processing. So no need to delimit it to the field. And so then what we have, something like that. And this kind of tactic, even with working with very large files, and I mean, when I say large, it's as big as you want type of thing. That's all you need to know. One of the things especially for the reference data, using JQ to send it to the shell, absolutely fantastic, because what it allows you to do is I actually send I usually send requests to all the reference data endpoints simultaneously, because then you'll get all of them back within a second. And then what you can do is you can bring in the data, stitch it together, and also the other thing you can do with these scalar arrays is you can create, you can put anything in them. Like I put the name in, but there's nothing to keep you from putting objects, or you could put JSON objects. It's whatever you need. It depends on what you need. And that's kind of like, so like what I say JQ is great for is like throwaway type things or one-offs. Very, very good for that. And you'll do a lot of that because that's what library work is, a lot of. So now we're getting to more fun examples. Again, I know this is going to be, this is not something anyone's going to remember, but that's what slides are for, so that you can see them later. And so what I'm doing is I'm merging values from one external file into merging values from an external file that are in plain text into part of the JSON in another file. And so like a actual use case for something like this would be, let's suppose you have this long list of items and we need to update, we need to stick all these notes in, or we need to do something with that, or patron notes. What I'm going through is I actually had to put like 250,000 notes into user records once using this technique. Why you need 250,000 notes in user records, I don't know, but they needed to be done. Anyway, what you'll see is the syntax is weird again, but what the important things to notice is, since the initial input of the first file is not JSON, and when we paste things, it's not going to be valid JSON, because that it will just be some stuff with a tab in between. We're going to interpret it as raw, then we split it. As soon as we split it, it becomes an array. And so that bracket 0, that's the first item, is the array, i.e. the contents of file 1. And since it's paste, it's one line at a time. And dot 1, what I'm doing is it says from JSON, but that's because it's thinking of it as a JSON string. So I want it to be thought of as actual JSON. And so what I'm doing is I'm assigning those. I could just use those array names, but that's confusing, especially if we were to go into some logical depth. So I'm assigning them variable names because then you can arbitrarily assign them. And then what I do is I just say, well, let's just assign the val key to the new variable. And so it comes out like that. And so that's a trivial example, but you can do that with actually very complex structures quite easily and very efficiently, I might add. And this is a kind of a nifty thing. So like the way that it might start out is somebody gives you a ton of data. And so what you do is essentially a dump of your records. And then what you do is you extract out one key that you're going to match on. And it could be anything like in the case of user records, I don't know, external system ID, email, or barcode or something like that. You do a join, and then you can do this paste thing. And if you're wondering, well, why not just glue the files together before doing it? It's because you need to create the array. And if you have it all in one file, the array will contain everything. And what you really need is one array per line. And so, I mean, it could be done the other way, just the processing is more complicated. So you have to sort of like think about how it works. Okay, now we get into the gotchas. Nulls, we talked about this a little bit. If something's not there, you need logic to filter out things. Well, best thing to do, filter out anything you're not interested in. You know, if it's not something I want, don't show it, that type of thing. Complex structures can be a little bit tricky to navigate because you have to like think about them. Parameters are actually kind of cool. We'll talk about those in a second. How do you get variables out? Because since JQ is its own process, that means it normally doesn't see environmental stuff, but we'll talk about how that goes. And then data types, although I'm going to tell you, make your life easy, except for if you're doing a mathematical type stuff, try to keep things as string. It's just easier. Nulls. You saw that in some of the examples. All you have to do to prevent problems with that, select on it. Select on it where it does not equal to null, and then do the selection, and you'll get no they'll get no problem. The second thing is actually really important because when you're creating reports and whatnot, you have to think of what's happening when you're creating, say, like a tab delimited report. What you're really doing is you're inhaling values, you're sticking them in an array, and then you're splitting on a tab. And what that means is if what you were looking for is not there, when you split, you will have the wrong number of fields. So you have this syntax, that double slash syntax, and this is exactly what I was talking about. It's unique to JQ. It tells you what you're telling it what to output if what you're looking for isn't there. So in this case, like I'm looking for some field, that double slash means send me an empty string instead. So if I were converting that to tab delimited, it would have an empty string. Now when I split it, it's going to have the right number of fields and everything lines up. Very, very important. Sometimes traversing, when you start working with complex structures where things may or may not be there at multiple levels, it's going to start getting a little bit more ugly. And there is, we have relative paths. There's multiple ways to suppress errors through select statements and whatnot. I'm just drawing your attention to this because when you first start, you're very likely to have run into this problem. Actually, what I would say is when you're starting, if you're starting with Folio, start with like item and user records and stuff like that. Something that's relatively holding stuff that's relatively straightforward. If you go into SRS, you're going to go out of your mind. I mean, there's some. Now, when you're doing SRS, you're styling and you'll be doing great. But then we can, now I'm like, I know no one's going to remember anything on here, but the important thing is to remember that it's possible because then you can look it up. And so what I'm doing here is I'm selecting, I'm just grabbing something and I'm selecting the ID. That weird syntax says no matter what's in the field. So like, let's suppose it's a number. Let's make it a string, and then for the first value, now we can see some parens around something. So try to select the barcode if it has a number in it. And if it has a number in it, then give me the string version of the barcode. But if you find no barcode, give me the ID instead. So that would be the second field. In other words, it would give the second field twice if there were no barcode. And then the third line, and you'll see a whole bunch of parens around it. Go into these variable fields, which could be an array, find all objects with this field tag, and take the content out of it. And if there are multiple instances of it, join it on a semicolon. And then if you don't find any objects mentioned following that, just give me an empty string and then convert that to tab delimited. So one of the things we've done very, very concisely is we have some pretty cool logic for, for selecting things. And so this is like really, really useful when you have multiple, well, actually, when you have inconsistent data where the data that you're interested in could be in one place or the other place. So what you can do is you can put tests in it and kind of like put a pecking order and have it go. And so what you can do is you can keep on stringing these things out. And if you remember from the earlier examples, we had our variables and stuff like that. And so you can go nuts with this stuff. And so the trick is just keeping it straight in your head, normal rules, make it readable, things like that. If you get too clever, even you won't be able to figure out what you did. Parameters. This is kind of like Unix style. So what you normally do is you define arguments. You define arguments and then you pass it through. You can use double quotes instead of single quotes, and then pass through, if you're using Unix type stuff, and pass stuff from your environment. However, be aware that everything is a filter. All punctuation, anything that means anything to JQ. So you will definitely need to handle all that, or you will get some very bizarre results. And then I threw in another symbol, add to an array or something like that. There's a million symbols. No way you're going to remember them all. Just to kind of like throw ideas in your head because stuff to look up later. Data types. One of the things, if you look at the instructions, you're going to see things that are kind of confusing. Like here, I show 3 ways to do the exact same thing. There's a toString method, there's add text, or I can do string interpolation. They're all legit. How do you know which one to use? It's the one you chose. Don't forget, it's like a lot of these things are designed by a single author. They design things to they design things to work the way they want to work. And so you'll find stuff like that. And so if it seems confusing, the little syntax, you'll also notice you'll see a map command. And what mapping does typically is you'll stick it in an array. Well, one other way to stick it in an array is just put brackets around. It's equivalent. So definitely, it's one of these things. Find what works for you. Don't stress the ones that you're not choosing. Some parting thoughts. You can do everything in you. And I'm going to go back to an XSLT analogy because I've seen people try to do everything in that. It's sort of like trying to do everything in SQL. They're really good at what they do. And they're really, really horrible at doing some other things that they're not really designed to do. JQ is like that too. The other thing, I would not recommend trying to just read it and understand it. To me, I mean, this kind of dates me, but it's like that studying the phone book. I know there's no phone books anymore, but if there were, it would be like that. It's you will remember things if you actually need them, and so just learn what you need. Again, avoid putting in loops because that's you want to invoke it once. It's all a problem. This fourth point, very, very useful. JQ is way easier than CQL. And I mean, first of all, CQL syntax isn't that great either. But the other thing is JQ gives you a lot more power. So what I typically do if I'm doing some large analysis is you throw the CQL query on a superset and then you cut through it with JQ and LB. It's a lot faster. another thing is when you're working with things, it's very useful to just structure for stuff like if I'm downloading a bunch of objects as part of the download process, you don't need them in the array like ever. And I say that literally as someone who works with this stuff every day. Take them out of the array, flatten them so it's like the flatten them so like the JQC is for like compact, so you have one line per record or whatever you're interested, because that way it'll tie in better to whatever process you're doing. No need to like try to make everything JQ. I would not go for elegance with it. That's not his strength. That's where it also shares very much stream editory that way. But that, let's see how we're doing for time. Okay, good. We're doing good. Questions? I talked a lot. People are laughing. Oh, there you go. The question was, is there a client that JQ runs easily in? Any environment that can invoke something from your like regular environment can do that. I date myself, but I use VI all the time. And the reason I use it is because it's on every operating system, and loading, editing 100 megabyte files is no problem and stuff like that. And so you can easily invoke stuff like that. I don't know, but anything that will allow you to essentially make a call to your system will allow you to do that. And that I would say is really handy, because then when you have like a large number of things, you can run the commands and see the results in real time. Because otherwise what you're doing is it's sort of like pouring water out of one container into another, where let's print out this file, run it through a filter, and look at the other file. It's much easier to just be in the file and just have it transformed before your eyes and see if that's what you want. So if you have a favorite editing environment that allows you to do that, I do think that's a great way to go. No, great question. Other questions? The question was, for those, the question, I'll broaden it out. The question was, for those hosted by EBSCO, what permissions would you need to be able to do something useful with this? The good news is whether or not you're provisioned by EBSCO, you already have assigned exactly the permissions that you want, because the staff will have permissions to view what they're supposed to view. They won't have permissions to view what they're not supposed to view. They will have permissions to edit what they're supposed to edit, and not have permissions to edit those other things. So, like, for example, if you're concerned where, they might edit item records or something like that, the only people that would be able to do that using their regular user credentials would be people who already have that permission. And so what they would do is, like, for example, we have some tools for Python, Shell, PowerShell, and we're getting stuff for Postman. So what they do is use whatever they wanted. The stuff comes down. They could manipulate this, and then push it back. And you can use any of those tools with this. And only those people that have those permissions will be able to do it. And they can already do it. They just don't know that they can. Other questions? All right. Well, I mean, it's a lot of time before lunch, but I mean, another question. The question is there an appropriate channel in Slack for this? Again, a great question. Unfortunately, one thing I've always noticed is whenever someone says that's a great question, you know that the answer is not going to be. What I would suggest, two things come to mind, and they're kind of unrelated because this is not really an API thing, but at the same time, it is of interest to people who would do the API thing. The other is there are some thematic type of there are thematic types. Like right now I've got metadata management on the head, but the reality is that anyone who's interested in extracting data easily, I think would be interested in it, because even if it's not something they use, kind of like, I need to have something that looks like this. Because that's what the staff are doing. That's the problem. I need something that looks like this. What is the easiest way to do that? And while sometimes you don't know what you need until you see it in front of you. You know, it's sort of like MarcEdit or any of the other kind of like useful things that have become part of our world. Yeah. The question is, don't try to use it for everything. Have I seen specific examples? Yes, I have. Not with Folio though. If you ever want to see great examples of what never to do, go to Stack Overflow. Um, the it is a site for coding dorks. And so what happens is some of them are like really into their craft, and some of them know this stuff like really well, and they'll get fixated enough on a tool that, you know, you can make anything do anything. You get some people that are, let's just say, very persnickety about things. And they'll make things that are like really, really complex when they need to be simple. You know, like, because there's the philosophically elegant way, there's the efficient way, there's kind of like, well, like one of the things, I'll back up to one of my slides that would have gotten me into like get me shot in a lot of environments. And this will, and this was going to jump out at plenty of the people in the room, and I'm sure they saw that, this eval station. Because what eval does is it says, take the output from this statement and run it like a command, because I'm interpret what you'd be able to do with something like that is, if you know what you're doing, you could, you know, like probably break out of it or something like that and do something weird. And so like there's some like, never ever use the eval statement, never ever use go to, that kind of stuff. But there's sometimes people will try to use something for everything, like all tools can be abused or disabused, or I mean abused or not used inappropriately. For example, a lot of times like SQL is extraordinarily handy, but there's some things that are really, really easy to do in a normal programming language that are very hard to do in SQL. So it's like, use a normal programming language for that. And likewise, there's some things that it's very good for. It's like, I think that's useful to, a good broad rule is, if it seems like it's too tricky, you're probably doing it the wrong way. Boy, that was a long-winded. Other questions? Um, One thing I am very loath to do is to tell people what tools to use, because your own workflow and preferred tools are, you know, kind of personal. Anything that makes sense to you is good. And because it's going to depend on your specific use case, the what is feeling right. Like usually if you're using the right thing, you're just gonna like it. And then if it's feeling like out of focus, because I mean, you can, in the middle of a Jupyter notebook, you can, you know, it's a sequence. Basically, you can think of it as a sequence of operations. So there's absolutely no reason you can't put it in there. So I would definitely not dissuade.
You could run it.
Yeah.
Rather than exclamation point and then pivot to all overall shell. That exclamation point and then followed by the command. That's the same thing. You want to run JQ on file created or pulled down Python. You just need to go back to that file.
Right. And exactly. And so what you could do is you could say, well, do I want to use one of the Python tools or is this just going to be easier? And so personal decision. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. And